All right, good? All right, this is block 6. This is the first notes. This is Jackson and Jacksonian Democracy. All right. Probably the most important figure in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is, in many ways, the prototypical American. He was born dirt poor. His parents were poor Scotch-Irish immigrants. He was born in Tennessee. His father died before he was even born. He had very limited schooling. Jackson truly was barely literate. He could not spell well at all. He was, honestly, he probably had the equivalent of about a 3rd or 4th grade education. And his entire political career, he would be using his instinct and his gut feelings more than any well thought out, intelligent, educated plan. During the Revolutionary War, at the age of 13, Jackson joined the militia and served as a courier, and as many of you saw in Johnson, it was there that he was captured by the British in battle and in a prisoner of war camp after he refused to clean the boots of a British officer. That British officer slashed his face with a sword, and then he was carried the scar there for the rest of his life. His brother died in the prisoner of war camp, and his mother, after spending so much time and energy trying to free them, died shortly thereafter. So at the age of 14, young Andrew Jackson was an orphan. But he had a drive about him that was unusual. And by the time he was 18 years old, he had set himself up as a lawyer. Now, being a lawyer in frontier Tennessee in the 1790s was very different from being a lawyer today. Jack's lawyering in the 1790s, especially on the frontier in Tennessee, was more a mixture of backroom deals and brawls and duels and lawsuits, more so than anything that actually was related to the law. Land speculation. Jefferson became, he was very good at all three, at duels, at speculation, and at backroom, wheeling and dealing, and became a very wealthy man. And he set himself up in his beautiful mansion called the Hermitage, which you can go visit today. And he was certainly, he bought many slaves, and he set himself up as one of the planter elite in Tennessee. He served as one of the first senators from that state and had a very strong political career going for him. He made his name, as we saw in Block 5 in the War of 1812, with his defense of the city of New Orleans. It made him a national hero. He earned his reputation for being a fearless general and sometimes a little crazy. His men alternated between loving him and absolutely being terrified of him. And he used that to his advantage constantly. He liked to sort of play at the fact that he was a little crazy, and would sometimes act a little crazy just so he could get his point of view across. And there was a case where he kind of lost his temper in the White House and went screaming and ranting and raving, and then after the people he had been screaming and ranting and raving about left, he turned to his friend and said, "You see, they all think I'm crazy." He used it to his advantage. After the War of 1812, he developed a further reputation as an Indian fighter. In Florida, he showed no mercy in war with the Indians, that they had been allied with the British, and his reputation as defeating the British as an Indian fighter would come to pay him very large dividends. He returns in the late 18 teens as a big military hero and champion of the common man, and that is what he is going to launch his political career with. All right, so let's get to his beliefs. What did Jackson believe? First of all, number one, the first thing that defined Andrew Jackson politically was his belief in the supremacy of the common man. Even though he had set himself up as one of the elite, he was a very common person. He was from that stock. He hated all differences in rank. He thought that the common man, the average person, the common American, could do everything just as well as anybody else. And because of that, a couple of political beliefs developed from his strong belief in the primacy of the common man. First of all, voting should have no property qualifications. Now let's go back in time a little bit. during colonial times and during the early part of the country, only people who owned property could vote. In some states it was a lot of property, in some states it was a little property, but most states had property requirements for voting. Jackson said even the poorest white man is the equal of every other white man. So Jackson wanted to do away with all of the remnants of, we have a visitor at the door. You can come in. I don't know if she's waiting. We stop. What's up? Okay. So Jackson believed that all property qualifications should be completely done away with, and even the poorest white man should have the ability to vote. Not only vote, but Jackson believed that every white man had the qualification to hold office as well. That if a person voted for the government, that meant that a person was qualified to be in the government. Jackson had a dislike and a distrust for any sort of scientific expertise. He said that if one man can do a job, any person can do a job. It's okay, keep it going, keep it going. This is not Hollywood quality. I could also edit it, later. I have the software. That's okay. All right, number 3. The next thing Jackson believed that he believed in this fundamental equality of white men, and that no one should have special privileges. He especially did not like the Eastern financial elite, all of Hamilton's people, the bankers and the big traders and the merchants. He had no time for them and thought that they should very much be kept in their place by the common man. He had a suspicion of large corporations and the people who controlled them, and he thought that everyone ought to have the same economic opportunity without either government restriction or without the restrictions of large banks and corporations. He is the champion, or at least he is seen as the champion of the common man. Now, he is a Jeffersonian in the sense that he believes that the federal government should be limited, but in the spheres that it has power, it is supreme. That he has no time for states' rights, he has no time for interposition, he has no time for anyone who would say that the states are more powerful than the federal government. In the spheres that the federal government has a job, it is supreme, period, end of story. So what made this guy so appealing? What made this guy, he was really the most popular American since Washington. And Washington's popularity was a distant popularity. People gazed up at Washington like he was almost like a Greek hero. Jackson is popular because he puts off this idea that he is one and the same with the American people. That the average American is Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is the average American. He was very patriotic. He loved America without any irony or without any sense of being he loved his country. And in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s, most Americans did too. So they identified with Jackson for that. He was very generous. He gave his money away to charity. You saw in Johnson, after he had ordered this awful massacre on an Indian village, kill all the men, the women, the children, burn it, he saw a 10-month-old infant, alive, clinging to his mother's dead body, and on the spot adopted it. That generosity of spirit endeared him to many Americans. His manner was democratic. He was not like Jefferson, who set himself up in a beautiful house with a beautiful dining room and spoke to the beautiful people in society. Jackson was at home there. Jackson could make good conversation in a mansion with the elites, but he was just as at home in a tent on the battlefield. And he was like Julius Caesar in that way. He was perfectly comfortable in both settings. He was incredibly loyal to his wife. His wife has a very interesting story, Rachel. She was an older woman who had been married before and had gotten a divorce. Jackson married her after this divorce, but it turned out that the divorce had not been finalized until right after Jackson married her. So his political opponents throughout his entire career accused him of bigamy, accused him of being married to a woman who was already married, and that really bothered him, and he went to great lengths to defend Rachel's honor. He was a fighter and a relentless one. If you crossed Jackson, that was not a good idea for you. And he fought several formal duels and lots of informal duels. Some of them ending formally, and some of them ending with Jackson and his opponent wrestling, in the mud in the street. To Americans of his day, he was both average and ideal at the same time, and that's why they were attracted to the man. In 1824, Jackson decides that he would like to run for president, and he is by far the most popular politician in the country. We're just coming out of the era of good feelings. Remember, the election of 1820, nobody even bothered to run against James Monroe. Everybody sort of agreed the same thing. And in 1824, it was very similar. Everybody said, hey, yeah, I'm a Jeffersonian, of course. So the political campaign started to become a campaign about sectional differences. And we've talked about those sectional differences, and those sectional differences are going to come out in politics now. Now, if you would fire up a map of the election of 1824, please. You keep going, so fire it up. All right, the candidates. The election of 1824 was a very interesting election because you still do not have political parties like we do today. So your first candidate, number one, was obviously Andrew Jackson. Jackson represented the common man, represented the West, represented, if you could blow that up to a larger size, that would be good. You can copy and paste it probably into a...
Put full size.
Yeah, no, full size. No, that's not better. Copy and paste it into a, what do you call it? So I'm sorry. Andrew Jackson represented the West and the common man. His main opponent was the great scion of the great Adams family, John Quincy. John Adams' oldest and greatest son. He had been raised since he was a very small boy to be one of the American elite. He was puritanical in manner, if not in religion. He was old and stubborn. He had many of the qualities, and he had many of the faults that his father had. He believed in equality. He was very, very anti-slavery. But a lot of people were turned off by his manner and his attitude, and he made lots of enemies in his life. But Adams runs for president in 1824, representing the North and New England. Also running for president was Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the senator from Kentucky. And also running, the fourth candidate, was a man by the name of William H. Crawford. Crawford was actually very popular, but Crawford, during the campaign, suffered a stroke, and his support obviously dropped because he had suffered a stroke. He represented the Old South, and but he continued to run for president as well. When the votes were in, and you can see it is a very confused looking election, that John Quincy Adams wins New England and the North, that Jackson is strong through the West and the South, that Crawford picks up some votes here in the Old South, and Henry Clay carries some of the Old Northwest. But when the votes were counted, no one had a majority in the Electoral College. And if you know how it works, now Jackson won. Jackson had more popular votes, and Jackson had more electoral votes than anybody, but he did not have a majority. So according to the Constitution, the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives. And it has to choose between the top three vote getters. And in 1824, those top three vote getters were Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Crawford, the guy who had the stroke, dropped out due to ill health. So in the House of Representatives, the election was between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. However, Jackson expected to win. Jackson said, I got the most electoral votes, I got the most popular votes, this is in the bag. But the Speaker of the House was none other than Henry Clay, who had come in fourth. And Henry Clay did not like Andrew Jackson. He was much closer in his beliefs to John Quincy Adams. And something went down between Adams and Clay that was referred to as the corrupt bargain. It seems, and there is no evidence to prove this, but it certainly seems that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams had a little meeting. And at the meeting, in exchange for his support in the House of Representatives, President Adams would make Clay his Secretary of State. After only one vote, due to Clay's influence, the House elected Adams over Jackson. Adams, without waiting more than a day, turned around and offered Clay the Secretary of State job. At that point, of course, all the Jacksonians in the country began howling and yelling, "Corrupt bargain," they said, "corrupt bargain," that you sold the office of the president in exchange for the Secretaryship of State. Neither Adams nor Clay ever confirmed it or denied it. So clearly, a deal had been struck. John Quincy Adams became president, and on the day that John Quincy Adams started his term, Andrew Jackson began running for president the next time. He did not leave Adams alone for those 4 years. Charges of corrupt bargain echoed through Washington and the country. Jackson had more supporters in Congress than Adams had. It was a very difficult 4 years for John Quincy Adams. His administration was in campaign mode. It had to be from the beginning because Jackson and his supporters were constantly attacking him. And in the best tradition of politics, the attacks got very, very nasty. Jackson's attacks on Adams included he was an aristocrat. That was sort of true. He had been raised, as part of the American elite from birth. Jackson charged that he was addicted to gambling. Not true at all. What had happened was he had a pool table installed in the White House for his enjoyment, and Jackson and his supporters turned that into a gambling addiction. They said he had cheated the government out of money. Totally not true. Jackson and his supporters said he's just like his father. He wants a monarchy in the United States of America. He's not a Democrat. He doesn't like the people. And that's obviously not true either. John Quincy Adams was no monarchist. Well, one good turn deserves another. Adams and his supporters began attacking Jackson very personally also. Said he was a bloodthirsty military tyrant, and that was sort of true, actually. He said he was illiterate, which was partially true. Now, a more serious charge was that Jackson represented the mob, the angry mob, the poor mob, the people that Hamilton and Madison had so carefully tried to keep out of power. Jackson is their biggest supporter. That if you elect Jackson, all you're doing is electing the mob to rule the United States. And they said that Jackson did not represent anyone of intelligence, did not represent anybody who could think, did not represent anybody who liked progress and science, and obviously those things were not true either. Adams' supporters claimed Jackson was a drunk. Not true. And of course, there was always the old standby. He had married his wife when she was married to another man. Technically true, but still a nasty personal attack that should have no business in politics. Through all this, Adams tries to be president of the United States. And he sought to modernize the American economy through internal improvements. He fought for roads and canals. He supported public education. He was the first president to do that. But in general, Jackson had more supporters in Congress, and just because they didn't like Adams, they constantly overruled him. After 4 years, Jackson is going to run again, but everyone sort of knows that there is no way Adams can win this election. That the election of 1828, if you could fire that one up for us, the election of 1828, that the election of 1828 belonged to Andrew Jackson. We're going to get a map. That's perfect. Look at that. Hopefully that, oh, look at that. Yeah, copy and paste that into the top. As you can see, the yellow represented General Jackson. He carried all, you can still see the remnants. Now, they're not called Federalists anymore, but if you look at the map of Jackson's election, the anti-Jackson forces are the same New England, Yankees, ex-Puritans, that culture is still against the Southerners, the Westerners, the rule of the mob, the rule of the common man. But the rest of the country was big enough and powerful enough now that the election of 1828 saw Jackson destroy John Quincy Adams 178 to 83 in the election. On a tragic note, Jackson's wife Rachel died a few weeks before he was inaugurated. She saw him be elected president, and then she died before he became president. And Jackson blamed Adams and the political attacks for weakening his wife to the point where it killed her. And carries that bitterness and that anger through the rest of his life. In March of 1829, Jackson is due to become president of the United States and had an inauguration unlike any in American history before or since. Jackson assumed only the elites would be showing up to his big inaugural ball. And after he gave his inauguration speech and walked to the White House, he is followed by all of these common people. Traders and shopkeepers and farmers in their regular clothing, in their dirty, dusty boots, start following him up Pennsylvania Avenue. And Jackson goes into the White House and kind of waves goodbye to the people, but they sort of took that as an invitation to come in. And they crashed through the White House barriers, destroyed the party that was set up. Jackson was lucky to escape with his life, that so many people crowded around him, wanted to touch him and say hello and congratulate him. Jackson was an old man. He had a bullet in him from a duel. That bullet could never be taken out. It was here in his lung. It caused him pain. He had abscesses on other parts of his body. He was tall and very thin, and he was not a strong man by the time he became president, and people actually feared for his safety. A couple soldiers kind of had to form a barrier around him and hustle him out of a back door. And then the crowd proceeded to destroy the White House in a crazy party, tramped all over the furniture, pulled the curtains off the walls, ripped them apart to take his souvenir home. When Jackson, he didn't even spend his first night in the White House. He had to stay at a hotel in Washington because things were so crazy. But when he takes up his job the next day, it seems as if that all of the fears that now America is going to be ruled by King Mob are about to come true. That what better evidence, his opponents say, of the mob of people that elected this man than people who will go and destroy the White House and crash a party. They think that this is just a symbol of the mob rule that they are about to have to endure. And then Jackson goes and does something that kind of makes them believe that mob rule is definitely around the corner, and that's called the spoils system. Jackson said, if you helped me get elected, you deserve a job in Washington. To the victor go the spoils. So government jobs by the thousands, people that had served in the previous administration were fired, and they were replaced by Jackson people, by Jackson and his men. Now, don't get the idea that he replaced everybody. Senior officials, people in the War Department, in the Navy Department, people of technical expertise were not replaced. But common everyday public servants were fired and replaced by Jackson's supporters. And the government in the 1820s was non-technical enough where you have to admit that Jackson's men, Jackson's supporters, did a pretty good job. They didn't bring the government down around them. And this contempt for experts was part of Jackson's appeal. We don't need an expert who has been doing this job for 12 years. Any common person can do this job. And Jackson went and sought to prove it. And by and large, he did. And the spoils system would become a part of American political culture throughout the rest of the 19th century. That if you supported the guy who got elected, you could expect to be taken care of by that politician and by that party, usually through a job or a job for a family member, that to the victor went the spoils. And if you helped him win, you got the benefit of a job. It did, of course, provide an easy line of attack for his political opponents. But it became a fixture in American politics. One of the things that Jackson did that reflects on him today very poorly was his policy of Indian removal. Most of the Indians that were still around in the United States east of the Mississippi River lived in the South, in Georgia, Alabama, and Jackson felt that the only way, now it does not make us see him as good, but in the 1830s, Jackson said the only way that the Indians can keep their tribal way of life was to move them out of the way of American settlement, move them out of the way of American cotton cultivation. The only way that the Indians could ever survive tribally was removed west of the Mississippi River. Jackson believed the Indians were savages. He made no bones about that. He did not believe that they were equal in any way. He believed that they were freedom-loving savages, but not a freedom that would ever work in the United States. And therefore, he reasoned the only way to save them was to remove them from the path of white settlement. Most of the tribes were paid money and left peacefully. And what that meant, when you left, it was settlement west of the Mississippi River, hundreds of miles away from the tribal lands where they had lived forever and ever. And some of these journeys were terrible to behold, and they were filled with disease and hunger and starvation and want and bad weather. It did not reflect well on Jackson, but to be perfectly frank, Jackson did not care. The important thing was that they were leaving. Some of the nations tried to fight back, but were defeated by the U.S. Army and resettled against their will. The Sac and the Fox in Illinois. The Fox chief Black Hawk led a war against the United States, which is chiefly remembered today because Abraham Lincoln, there's his name for the first time in this class, Abraham Lincoln was a militia officer in the Black Hawk War. Saw no action, but kind of made a local name for himself. And obviously we're going to come back to Lincoln lots and lots and lots, but this is his first foray into American history. The Seminole in Florida fought back, were defeated, and forcefully removed. It fit in with the romanticism of the times that Americans liked almost when the Indians fought back, because then they could kind of get this sense of desperately hanging on to their tribal lands and falling in a glorious last stand. It's very romantic. We like that idea. That's why we like the movie 300. We like the idea of a last stand. It's very romantic. Sticking up for what you believe in to the death. But obviously, Americans were much happier when the Indians went down fighting, and they did. They either left peacefully or went down fighting. The saddest case in this Indian removal were, without a doubt, the case of the Cherokee. The Cherokee had watched what was happening in white America, and saw what was happening to all the other Indians. So they said, you know, the only way that we can possibly survive as a tribe is to become like them. So they had stopped their nomadic way of life. They had set up as farmers and traders and you know, small craftsmen and cattle raising. They had developed a language. They had a daily newspaper. They had democratic elections for a tribal council where they elected their leaders. They drafted a constitution. They said, we are going to be whiter than the white man. And we are going to use that to hold on to what is rightfully ours, our land. That if the United States government is saying the Indians have to leave because they're tribal and savage, we're going to show them that we are settled and civilized, and that means that we can stay where we want to stay. They declared that their lands were an independent state inside Georgia. And several treaties with the United States government seemed to show that this was accepted by the United States government. That there was Georgia, and then inside Georgia, there was the Cherokee Nation. The state of Georgia disagreed. The state of Georgia said, look, you can't have an independent country inside the United States. It's not possible. And they declared that all laws passed in Cherokee Nation were null and void because the laws in Cherokee Nation were going to be the laws of Georgia. The Cherokee decided to take this on in the best white man's way. They took Georgia to court. They sued them. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. John Marshall is still Chief Justice. And in one ruling, he ruled that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign state in the sense of the Constitution, but in another ruling, he ruled that because the United States had these treaties, that Georgia could not interfere in Cherokee territory. That Cherokee territory was the territory for the Cherokees and not territory for Georgia. This infuriated President Jackson. Jackson said it is impossible that there is a foreign country inside the United States. Jackson reasoned if every single Indian tribe was a foreign country inside the United States would be a country filled with little holes. And he said criminals could go there and escape from the law. Foreign enemies could put, spies in there. And he had a point that to imagine the United States existing with dozens and dozens of independent countries inside of the states is a difficult thing to imagine. It doesn't make what Jackson did to the Cherokee right. And it doesn't make what he did constitutionally really that great either. His quote upon hearing Chief Justice Marshall's decision, he said, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And he pretty much ignored the Supreme Court. And if the chief executive of the United States ignores the Supreme Court, there's nothing anybody can do. He's too popular to impeach. No one will ever impeach him for this. They're not going to crucify President Jackson, the most popular man in America, on the cause of some Indians. It's not possible. And Jackson knew that. So he pretty much told Marshall where he could stick it. Soon after Jackson left office, the state of Georgia decided that it wanted the land that the Cherokee were living on. It was good for growing cotton. They asked for the government help to remove the Indians, to remove the Cherokee. And that removal is known to history as the Trail of Tears. In 1838, 15,000 Cherokee, the entire tribe, were forced to pick up and leave Georgia and go to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. And it was the middle of the winter, and the scenes of death and desolation and bad weather were drawn by artists, and they are very difficult to behold. That it was a forced march like the worst that the 20th century had to offer. On the way, 4,000 Cherokees died, and it became known as the Trail of Tears, and it is one of the blemishes on the American historical record. By the year 1840, due to Jackson's policies with the Indians in the Southeast, there are virtually no Indians living in tribal settings east of the Mississippi River. All of the continent east of the Mississippi was pretty much Indian free. And I guarantee you, that's how Jackson liked it. So that's General Jackson and some of his subsidiary rulings and policies. We're going to talk next about some of Jackson's big events. He has two of them, particularly one will be his war against the bank, and his second one will be the nullification crisis. All right, so that was Jackson and Jacksonian Democracy, notes number 1. All right.